Still missing the chair. Sorry? Still missing the chair. I hear it. It's not as comfy as the other ones, but...
Oh, this is a chair. It's better than...
Oh, you don't know them? Priscilla was in...
Yeah, it's fine. Want to invite them in, or should they sit now? It's not like you're doing a long introduction.
No, yeah, we'll just...
Yeah, I think it would save a bit of time on that. The fifth chair has arrived.
Like they were saying, how do you get people to invest outside?
No,
Don't fight.
Oh no, not the comfy chair. Famous Monty Python.
Sorry?
Oh no, not the comfy chair. It's a famous Monty Python sketch.
I don't know that sketch, but I need to build up my British culture. Actually, do you need an intro? Like, you're just cracking on. I'm here, like.
Yeah. Oh no. Well, yeah. I mean, you can introduce me.
Come on, just to introduce my board.
Oh, yeah, okay.
The famous. No, I'm kidding. Should we crack on? I know.
Yeah. No.
Some people
we can.
may still come.
I mean, no. I'll be.
That's
like
okay.
prattling on for 5 minutes now, like a few minutes.
Okay, that's fine. We're just coming in from that, and 10 minutes before the end, I'll stand to ask questions. Okay?
Oh, it's o'clock now. I didn't know.
Yeah, but I can do it for you.
Yeah, but what time is?
I'll do the timer. Don't look at the time. I'll do it. Okay? Yeah, keep an eye. All right. So while few more people are arriving, I think we need to kick off because we have a packed agenda this afternoon, following on this great discussion on big developments in our industry in 2021. And first panel discussion of this afternoon, driving real-world patient centricity, is obviously at the heart of what everyone is doing in the industry. I guess the purpose of the panel is not to talk about why patient centricity is important. It's a given for everyone, or should be, especially after this morning panel. But it's more to dig into the how practically implement this patient centricity. And so we have a stellar, diverse panel that will have this discussion in the next 50 minutes, and chaired by a none less stellar chair that you met this morning, Mike Board, Head of Global Thought Leadership.
Yeah.
Got it in the right order?
Yeah.
At Clarivate. So I won't go into detail of Mike's biography. You know him, and I'll hand over to him to ask the intelligent questions. Mike?
Okay, thanks very much, Aline. Yeah, I don't have business cards because my job title is so long. Yeah, it's something like that. So this patient centricity is the name of this panel, and I was not the original chair for this, but because people can't travel around, etc. I was asked, would I sort of step in and do this? And this is, in fact, a subject that is very close to my heart. It's something that I've been pushing at Clarivate. Everybody be aware that lots and lots of companies in the sort of the life sciences space will have is part of their submission statement that they put the patient at the centre of everything they do, etc. And for the past sort of 9 months, I've been looking to actually sort of see where exactly is that, that patient, are they heard, are they being listened to? So I'm really looking forward to hearing what our panelists have got to say, because they represent different stakeholders across the whole of that ecosystem, because I think that there's probably a role for the patient voice to help shape the experiences across that whole timeline of discovery to development. So to kick off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the panelists to each sort of just give a little introduction and sort of describe or define what patient centricity or patient engagement looks like to them. So what I'm going to do is we'll start with Phillippa, and then we'll just come back towards me. Phillippa.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Phillippa Brown. I'm the Head of Development Operations at AstraZeneca, which means my organisation is currently conducting around about 450 clinical trials from phase 1 to phase 3 across multiple indication areas, from oncology to cardiovascular, renal medicine, respiratory and infection. My team have obviously been heavily involved with vaccine and monoclonal antibody development as well. What patient centricity, or the voice of the patient, means to us is absolutely ensuring there is a mechanism by which we can hear that voice in how we design our clinical trials, so that we're designing trials that have less burden and encourage participation. We're also wanting to utilise our patient voices in how we're developing digital strategy. So obviously the big push for decentralisation, remote ways of working, enabling patients to participate in clinical trials from the comfort of their own home. That technology burden is something that we really want to get ahead of and make sure that's easy. And we want to optimise the clinical trial experience, so listening to the patient voice during and after a clinical trial that they've been part of, so we can feed that into continuous improvement as we go. And all of that with a view of, can this help us also in the endeavour to broaden inclusion and diversity of the trials that we're running? So really what we want to do is amplify that voice into our strategic teams, into our design teams, into our digital health strategy, to ensure that we can continue to drive clinical research. As a stat, 70% of patients who are eligible to participate in clinical trials choose not to. I think that is a huge opportunity for both the patients and ourselves to try and unlock that potential in our trials.
Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. My name's Mark Avery. I'm the Director of Health Informatics, working for Cambridge University Health Partners and the Eastern Academic Health Science Network. But as part of that role, I'm also the operational lead for one of the Health Data Research UK designated health data research hubs, so one called Gut Reaction, focusing on inflammatory bowel disease. So I don't necessarily claim to be any great expert in this space, other than being able to sort of share the experience of trying to shape patient and public involvement in some fairly large sort of data programs using multiple types of data from different sources. So I think patient centricity for me, if we take it literally, putting patients in the middle of what we're doing, I think it's the central convening theme in the very complex stakeholder management picture we're quite often in. So if we're actually going to share data for research use, then we need to meet interests of patients and the public, obviously, but also meet the needs of industry, acknowledge the needs of academic research, meet the needs and satisfy the sort of the safeguarding requirements of individual NHS organisations as well. And aligning those incentives is quite difficult, and putting patients at the middle, or patient and societal benefit at the middle, is the sort of the central convening hook, I think. That's me.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Natalie Wilson, and I work for the National Institute for Health Research.
within the clinical research network. I'm a business development manager there, and it's my role to support life sciences industry to conduct their clinical research in the UK. So, of course, the mission statement of the NIHR is to improve the health and wealth of the nation through clinical research. So, obviously, participants and patients are key to that. And to that end, in 2018, we started to develop our patient engagement in clinical development service. So that really is about putting the participant first. So we help broker the sort of relationship between patient groups and life sciences industry to ensure that that a trial is essentially fit for purpose. But I'll expand a little bit further on that later. And similarly to what Phillippa was mentioning around the decentralised clinical trials, obviously in the last 18 months we've found ourselves in a particularly different environment and been rather challenging for the traditional bricks and mortar type clinical trials. So within the clinical research network, we've moved and made changes to enable us to continue to bring clinical research to participants. So that's a big area for us as well within the clinical research network.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Paresh Malhotra. I'm an academic neurologist at Imperial College London and Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust. And so I see patients and recruit them into clinical trials, as well as designing, implementing and running clinical trials and being a PI at Imperial. So for me, patient centricity is really thinking about what a trial is for and then being able to explain that to patients, carers, participants, and knowing that every aspect from recruitment through participation and the results is fit for them and how they live their life.
Well, good afternoon. I'm John Gallacher. I'm Director of Dementia's Platform UK, a public-private partnership operating in the translational space for dementia. We run data integration, precision recruitment, and an experimental medicine incubator. For me, patient centricity is negotiating and perhaps renegotiating the social contract at the heart of engaging all stakeholders in the scientific enterprise.
So, I think it's probably a good way to almost like start. So, when trying to marshal all those resources and getting everybody on board, what are the sort of the usual challenges that you face? What are the barriers that some of the stakeholders might put up? So, John, I'm going to ask you to start.
Okay. So, to use an ancient metaphor, if organising and subduing this planet is all about collaboration, which it must be, the issue really is helping people understand the exchange of benefits. And my experience has been that when people do have a broad understanding of the exchange of benefits, they are more trusting, they are more participating. And I don't just mean the patients, I mean the scientists and industry collaborators as well. So somehow we've got to rethink what the exchange of benefits are. We need to articulate this. And as we do that, we find that people are actually very willing to help because they see not just the benefit to them, but the greater social benefit.
Phillippa.
So within AstraZeneca, we conducted 30 interviews and surveyed 700 people to get their view on what was holding them from having a patient-centric approach. And 80% felt that there wasn't enough senior leadership who were really supporting the ambition, which I think is really important. But I think the bigger finding was 60% of them really struggled with the conflict of science versus patient centricity. So when you need to design a trial to meet the needs of regulators, payers, when you want to put lots of exploratory research in to fully understand disease mechanisms, that was a real conflict when you started to then look at patient burden. Barriers like time, resource, financial constraints, lack of a clear process that you feel you can go out and engage with patients in the right way also came through.
Okay, so I'm going to sort of, as a follow-up, so how did you reconcile that? And then I'd be really interested to sort of hear if you know, other panelists have also got, you know, sort of, you know, insights they'd like to share. So at AZ, you know, you've got 400 and whatever trials that you said you were running.
Yep.
How did you reconcile those challenges?
So there's a real need during the clinical trial design process to really almost walk through the implications of that design in a real life setting, which I'm sure as a PI, Paresh, you know, the value of actually looking at the reality of what you're doing is critically important, and it makes it much easier to make the decisions then about how important something is to keep within a clinical trial versus actually I'm interested in that, but it's not critical. And if that means my patient doesn't have to spend 7 hours in one single clinic visit to do a clinical trial, then let's give on it. So I think it's about what's the consequence of those decisions in the real life setting.
We had that within, so when after the patient engagement and clinical development service was set up, you know, we did a pilot with Pfizer, and the first studies were a couple of eczema studies, one in adolescents and one in adults, and it was very much that walking through the protocol. And one of the factors that was picked up in the adult population was it was prohibited to take other medicines. It's like the feedback from the patient group was, well, actually, I'm not going to be prepared to take part if I can't take any of my other medication. And similarly for the adolescents, the explanation, the scientific and technical explanation within the protocol, it was like, I don't actually know what you mean when you're saying you're going to modify or alter my immune system. So it's all those doing that walkthrough, you know, the learnings through that every step of that sort of protocol to make sure that you end up with something that's suitable for the participant, because it's the participant that's living with this condition.
Paresh?
Yeah, just to agree with what's been said already, and also to say that if patient centricity is lip service and window dressing rather than a fundamental part of the entire process, it gets very difficult. And we have the same tension in academia as well, that, oh, should we put that extra test and it might give us some additional information. If that additional information is useful, then it's often surprising how often patients and public representatives say, actually, if you need that, it'll work. But then that comes back to explanation and having someone help you write the patient information sheet, to make a video to show you how a lumbar puncture takes place and how uncomfortable or not uncomfortable it is. These are the sorts of things that make it much easier for people to make an informed decision rather than feel that they're being railroaded or that they're going to be a guinea pig.
I think making an informed decision is a really interesting concept. If you're thinking about increasing molecular and cellular complexity of studies, informed consent, for example, is absolutely complex. And it boils down to trust. It boils down to the participant trusting the environment, seeing the value of the research question, and therefore being prepared to say, well, I don't really understand what this means, but actually you've convinced me that it's worth doing, and therefore I'm going to go for it. And that is a genuine consent, but it is very, very much a trust broad-based consent rather than an in-detailed informed consent.
Okay, so I mean, it's interesting sort of that concept of informed consent, because I chaired a webinar last week on sort of the challenges around clinical recruiting for clinical trials for gene and cell therapies, where often it involves, you know, pediatric patients, and it's also very, very complex technology that's involved, that actually patients kind of almost like felt obliged, because their clinician was telling them that this is a good thing to be on this trial, even though they didn't really understand. So informed consent, how do you actually really identified that the informed consent actually, they actually understand everything.
So personally, I start by asking what people understand to begin with, and then going through things, ask again. And not to the point of setting an examination, but to understand really what does this mean for you? Do you appreciate that you may be getting placebo? Do you appreciate that you will have to come 3 or 4 times to hospital in the middle of a pandemic, whatever it happens to be? And trying to get that information across, and involving family, and involving sort of carers, and then giving people the opportunity to think about things rather than rushing people through in a clinic, and also giving the people the opportunity to speak to other clinicians and researchers, I think, is critical, because if PIs can be over-invested and pushed, and people do have the right to say no and not participate when they know what's going on.
Right.
And for us within the NIHR, it's very much around that sort of that early engagement with participants, because as we sort of mentioned, that walkthrough of the protocol, getting that clear understanding, you know, the Pfizer example that I gave about, you know, the adolescents going, well, actually, I don't know what that means. And then there was also some adaptation to the patient information leaflet, you know, to so if you're engaging with those, you know, with those participants living with that condition, then, you know, should be getting a clear picture of ensuring they're understanding what the trial is asking of them.
Okay, so I just want to remind everyone that there is an opportunity to ask questions. We'll take them in the last 10 minutes. If there are questions, then just you know, wave madly and we'll get you a microphone. So if you've got a question, sort of think about it and we'll come to it. If not, I've got plenty of questions to keep us going. So, Mark.
I was just going to ask if I could come in on the consent as relates to use of data point, if that's okay. So, and this is one of those areas that we found quite challenging in our discussions with patient groups, in terms of, you know, understanding how, you know, or what secondary uses of data might be if you are asking people to sign up to those things. But also, and this has been one of the tricky things. So we know that most people would like to be asked their permission for their health data to be used for research, and mostly in connection with individual studies. So there was a particular sort of Ipsos Mori poll back in 2016, which is still probably the most comprehensive study of patient attitudes or patient and public attitudes to use of data for commercial use. The report is very good, called the One-Way Mirror. But the thing that's come out of our conversations with our patient advisory committees is that in terms of their data for research, they would really like to be asked for consent about different types of use. And it is by far better and or simpler from an administrative perspective to have more of a blanket view to consent. So actually these are all of the things that we would like to use your data for, and it's an either a, you know, you sort of opt into that, and if you sign up to it, you sign up to everything. And patients are increasingly asking for a more modular view about how data can be used by what types of organisations for what purpose, which is going to throw up all sorts of administrative challenges. But if we go back to John's sort of point around the extent to which trust and this social contract is key, then actually being able to put the control in the hands of individuals about how their data is used is going to be one of the really important things to do. So I think that's both a challenge and an opportunity thrown up through certainly our engagement around use of data.
John.
So we have 2 elements of the consent. Consent for the procedures, and I think what Paresh has described as, you know, is absolutely best practice as far as I'm aware. And then there's the consent for use, and the problem is that the use becomes increasingly granular. So to have somebody say in principle, yes, I want to consent for each use, so to speak, which is wonderful, until they get, you know, 15,000 requests for each SNP coming from one study. So at some point, there has to be, as I say, this negotiation of benefits, this understanding of at what level patients wish to be asked about the consent for studies. And then I would say that you build trust by design, that you have these systems for enabling the consent to be vetted ethically by independent third parties, so that everybody involved understands transparently and clearly what is going on, and therefore they can consent at different levels of granularity. Without it being opaque, without people not being able to audit it, it's actually quite straightforward. I appreciate it's a technology issue, but we have that technology. And I think to build that confidence in the wider public, that there are genuinely shared benefits. There are benefits for industry producing medicines. There are benefits for people participating in studies. There are benefits for clinicians being able to give better treatments. That sort of discussion, I think, might bring us into bring everybody into the research enterprise, so that it's not just the few who see the value, but it's the population that sees the value.
Okay, so I'm sort of thinking about this, and I may have misconstrued this, and you can jump down my throat if I have done. But what's been described so far is it's a contract, and the deal is it's a bit like when you sign up for Google or Apple or whatever, and they've sort of sent you the latest update and all that data and information, and you just want to get into your iPhone or your iPad, and you say, I agree. I've got no idea what I've agreed to. And I kind of sort of feel that it's that kind of relationship. And I might be wrong, but I just sort of think it's a bit passive on the part of the patient. And I just wonder if you had any examples where the patient voice was actually listened to and actually allowed you to sort of reorganize what you're originally planning to do, so that it would align more with the sort of the welfare needs of the patient, or in the case of dementia patients, their carers as well. So who would like to answer that? Mark?
I can take one quick example. So with my work with gut reaction, so this is the Health Data Research Hub focusing on inflammatory bowel disease data. So essentially we're joining up data between, this is for consented individuals signed up to the NIHR bioresource nationally, who've consented for their health records to be used for research. And they provide a lifestyle questionnaire, they provide blood or saliva from which DNA is sequenced, and they give sort of permission for their health records to be accessed for research use. And the reason they sign up to the bioresource in the first place is as a potentially recallable resource by either genotype or phenotype for clinical trials. So that's why it was set up in the first place. And the sort of the byproduct of data being collected and collated and having its own value as part of that process has increasingly been recognised, which is why the hub has been formed. So the process by which people can apply for access to data did have patient involvement. It was very, but it was a sort of a single patient on the steering group committee that made the decisions when things came through for. So certainly any applications from industry came through for use. And to be fair, I think more of the straightforward academic requests went through a process that, if it ticked the right boxes in the right order, didn't necessarily go in front of a patient at all, but it was for academic research and therefore deemed to be sort of less sort of high risk, if you like, in terms of uses of the data. But with some really quite extensive work with our patient advisory committee, that sort of process has been completely redesigned. The requirements for setting out what a research study is and what the patient and societal benefits are as part of a lay summary have been made much clearer and upfront, rather than just dealing with a lay summary that comes as it comes and quite often isn't very lay in the language that's used. So some much clearer requirements about getting the lay summary right before you can even get through the front door triage. And then there's a sort of a feasibility assessment from a technical point of view. And if it isn't ruled out at that stage, then it goes through to a sort of a patient advisory committee that is now becoming a more formal data access committee with other sort of members on the panel. So And that process was genuinely redesigned and put together in workshops, working alongside, if not predominantly led by patients.
Phillippa.
I've got a slightly different example. As I mentioned before, we're using more and more digital technology in our clinical trials. So we've developed an app. One was mentioned in the previous panel, but it's specific to cancer patients. And the intention of the app is to enable them to document adverse events or symptoms that they may be feeling and have a much closer connection with their healthcare provider, their physician, so that they're monitoring the progress of that cancer patient throughout their journey. And we didn't want to just launch that and hope it worked. We convened a large panel of patients from different geographies and took them through the process of even how you upload it, never mind how you use it, to ensure that when it actually went live, it was something that patients would really understand what it was there to do, understand how it was helping in terms of their medical care, and it was usable. And so throughout that process, it ended up with 90 design changes from where it started, which is quite significant, I think. If we'd started with the original, thinking what we thought versus what we ended up with when we actually went live, it possibly would have had the detrimental effect of actually disenfranchising patients and them not believing it was actually helping them in the journey that they were on with their treatment.
And what you did there, is that then something that is sort of transferable to and almost becomes sort of baked into the way you do things?
Absolutely. And so in partnership with our digital health organisation, anything that's patient-facing, we've got a large panel of patients, as I say, from different geographies, different indications that we try and pull on now, because we realise that if they can help us shape what they need better than we can develop, believing we know what they need. So patient panels for us are really critical, not just in clinical trial design, but as you say, the materials, the apps, the technologies that we're putting into our trials now.
Yeah, and I guess for clinicians, I mean, that's sort of, because your role normally with the patient is you do the diagnosis and then you sort of like develop a course of treatment. You are the expert. How easy is it to, again, allow the patient to shape your thinking?
So to begin with, I had, I guess, an instinctive, inertia in this context. And I was, clinician knows best, scientist knows best, I know best. And then certainly over time, it's just become clear that they are shaping everything. Their symptoms are more important often than any test results that I will get. Their approach to how we design research is more important, really, than any fancy idea that I'll come up with. And even to the point of thinking of new ideas, passing it by a patient and their family, or just starting to ask, is that a real problem, or is it just something we observe and it makes no difference to you, is actually very important. And now, more and more charities and patient societies are setting priorities for research, like the James Lind Alliance does. And so seeing that priority list of what actually affects patients and their carers, that should help inform the design of research rather than sort of pseudo-clinical observation or us thinking we know best.
And of course that leads to the increased patient benefit and also a much better patient retention on the clinical trials. Absolutely. So, Phillippa will probably comment more on sort of what the sort of dropout rate is for sort of clinical trials, but if you're getting it right from the start, having that participant involvement, then retention into clinical trials makes a huge difference.
Absolutely, and I mean, what we're looking at, 20-30% easily dropout, if not higher. And the longer a trial goes on, and we have outcome trials that can go on for many, many years. Fortunately, our oncology trials are going on for many, many years now. We're going into much earlier disease settings. That continued engagement throughout is just as important. And even the materials or the support that you give in the management of a patient's disease throughout that 5-year period is just as important as what we might be collecting from them to drive that retention.
And that's something that the NIHR is working on at the moment in partnership with NHS Digital, is a digital trial engagement piece, and that is very much about the participant being in control and aware of what's happening to them, being able to talk with the researchers, the research team, and importantly, the sort of follow-up at the end of the study, being kept informed of what's happening. I know I, for one, have definitely taken part in a clinical trial, many years ago, and I went and did my patient visit, and that was it. I never heard again. I have no idea what the effect of the outcome of the research is. And so this is very much what this digital trial engagement piece is about, is keeping participants informed of what's happening on their clinical research journey, so that we can continue to encourage participants and patients to take part in clinical research.
So in the Dementias platform, we have a different scenario. We run a preclinical research register where people across the risk spectrum are invited to be considered as research ready, consented for recontact. And we're just beginning this, so we don't think our system is very mature in hearing the patient voice. But we have, through various focus groups, identified the fact that there are some procedures that people are unwilling to do. So to know this and respect that, we find very helpful. Secondly, if you're running a research register, you do need to keep people engaged. And so we run a series of, if you like, online and face-to-face seminars about different aspects of the work, different research questions, things that are coming up. And it is a matter of just trying to keep the interest. But the fundamental issue here really is respecting the person and finding out what we can do to show that individual they are genuinely valuable as a person and not just as a research subject.
Mark.
Really quickly on that recognising value point. We've talked a lot about value propositions, but also the value transaction needs to be right in order for people to participate in research, be that as a trial participant or from a data perspective. But in terms of patient and public participation and involvement in helping to shape and design things, that almost starts becoming a proper job that needs proper preparation and time and quite a time commitment if it's going to be done properly. And it's a little bit controversial. We had some operational difficulties with our hub work, sort of getting this into place, but actually appropriately financially recognising or reimbursing people for their time is something that has made a genuine difference to the quality of the time commitment and feedback that we've had from the participants in our sort of studies. But from a stakeholder engagement point of view, hands up, it's also been a little bit of a challenge because people have been sort of a bit concerned about the precedents that sets elsewhere. But genuinely, I think it comes back to this transaction kind of question again. But actually, people really are putting the time and effort into considering and providing sort of quality feedback, not necessarily what we want to hear, but certainly a considered response to the questions that we're asking, and we've seen that be a trigger for a change.
So you're thinking about the sort of patients that you choose. So Phillippa, you were talking about how you have these groups of patients and you sort of, you go to them and you seek advice. How do you ensure that the patient group you have is truly representative of the general population? Because we know that 87% of people in clinical trials are actually white, Caucasian, and possibly male, which is not representative of the population. So how do you ensure, and I'd be interested in sort of hear what others are, that the people that you're listening to are not just the people who shout the loudest?
It's a great question. It requires a multi-pronged approach. There's no one way of doing it. AstraZeneca have been running a patient partnership program now since 2017. It's across 13 disease areas. We've got 140 patients engaged in it, and across 9 countries, so that's trying to represent some diversity. So that's one way of setting up a program in which patients who have got the passion and interested in helping themselves and or their community. Clearly when you're that engaged to do that, you're probably going to get some really high quality feedback. But you've got to look at your demographic, you've got to look at and if you are missing important parts of the population, so in underserved minority groups, for example, you may have to take a different approach of getting into the community there, and influences in the community to try and hear that voice. And then there's other areas, there's patient advocacy groups. I find the study coordinators who work often directly with patients, they can bring you insights into how can we amplify the voices that we're not hearing. So it's not easy. You've got to just go multi-prong.
Just to add to that, so I think the trusted user group approach is very helpful, but actually making feedback about the trial process part of the outcome measures. So looking at dropout, looking at the reasons for people dropping out, and then at the end, when participation is completed, getting feedback about the process, which were the most difficult parts, what were the problems in taking part, and people who don't take part, if they're happy to give you information about why, then asking that. All of those give you a bit of extra information about why you might not be reaching certain people, or be able to keep people in your trial.
In a previous answer, Phillippa also mentioned sort of like the use of apps. I'd just be kind of interested. What are the tools or the techniques that can be almost like industrialized in the process? Can be baked in so it almost becomes a standard operating practice.
That's very much components of the decentralised clinical trials that we'd sort of mentioned before, because sort of leading on for what we're talking about from the sort of inclusion aspect, that sort of the outreach to that you have to a sort of patient population. So if I think about our IBS diarrhea study that pre-pandemic was a traditional sort of bricks and mortar study, but once the pandemic started, then that converted to a fully virtual, and the recruitment was, there was added benefits that the recruitment was faster and the retention was greater, but actually more importantly, the sort of geographical outreach for those participants to be able to take part in the trial. These are participants who, given their condition, are not really willing to travel to sites, so to be able to offer the opportunity to be able to, receive the medicine in their own home, having those teleconferences, telephone calls, nurse home visits. So I think the different tools that we're seeing within decentralised clinical trials, whether it's the trial as a whole or aspects of it that enable that participant to participate from the comfort of their own home, and often at a time that's convenient to them, because if you're working childcare, a whole range of different commitments, to be able to sort of offer that flexibility. So that really does help with the increasing sort of diversity, inclusion. And just one final point around with the Vaccine Registry, and so when there was a huge influx of names put forward, and as you were described, sort of white male. But then it was us taking different approaches to, our business development director, she was going out into the Asian community, into doing broadcasts on Asian radio. It's just different ways of trying to, get the message out there. It can't just be, log on to the internet and see what's happening.
Okay, just bring John. But first, just want to remind you that if you've got a question, if you can put your hand up, we'll get a microphone to you. John.
Yep. So technology is key here. Not only is it permanent is too strong a word, but it's there. You can improve it, you can develop it over time. You can tweak it for different subgroups, tweak it for different conditions. So it's good for consent. It's also good for assessment, to be able to do away with interviewer variability, the imprecision of questionnaires, to be able to achieve objective measurement will reduce the size of trials and increase the speed of trials considerably. But also, it allows you to tailor-make these studies for retention purposes.
So, right, have we got any questions? Yep.
Hi. This discussion has been very much focused on attracting patients into the trials and keeping them on the trial. What about those populations that are actively denied to participate in trial? I mean, there are patients with comorbidities that are regularly excluded from the trials, although those comorbidities actually represent the larger part of that patient population. There are also healthy populations like women, very often, pregnant women even more often, and patients with certain other aspects that are actively still denied participation. What are your organizations doing about those?
So who want to have a shot? John. I think they all want to have a shot, actually.
Yeah.
John.
I can't claim any credit for this, okay? No contribution whatsoever. But the recovery trial is a really good example of designing trials differently. So you by increasing the size, and you can do that by the speed of recruitment, you can absorb greater variation and not lose precision. And I think ultimately that would be the direction for a whole swathe of trials.
Just to say that I think looking into specifically people with multi-morbidities, I think is very important for our organisation and the NIHR as a whole, and then trying to interact with people who come to clinics, come to GP practices, and realising how many people are being excluded at the sort of facing end of the trial is very important, because when you see all those people working in Alzheimer's in particular, and so maybe people with kidney disease or heart disease or some degree of vascular disease are excluded from trials, then it's very important in the design of trials, and we're trying to do this much more at Imperial, to be inclusive of those individuals and try to take these things into account in larger studies.
And just to add to that, that's something that the NIHR is looking at the moment. We've got a number of work streams that are looking at multiple long-term conditions. So, it is a really important priority for the NIHR. And I guess for us, within the NIHR, it's like, well, how do we work? Our next steps is how do we work with industry on doing these types of studies? What approaches are our pharmaceutical biotech companies going to take to address these multiple conditions, comorbidities?
Okay, so most of my and my team's focus is around the data as a byproduct from this work, but actually working very closely with the NIHR bioresource, alongside recruiting to specific disease themes, I guess. A healthy bioresource and a children's bioresource and a mental health bioresource are all new additions where recruitment is being sought. And actually the traditional method of identifying people in an outpatient clinic does seem to be maturing into participants for the mental health bioresource, for example, were predominantly recruited via a Facebook campaign. The healthy, in inverted commas, bioresource, but the healthy volunteers that would like to see their data or information or samples otherwise used for research can sign up direct on the website. That said, that's still very much people wanting to get involved doing the approach, if you like. So I think there's still an awful lot more everybody can be doing around making the benefits and the value of participation in research more visible and more accessible to harder to reach groups. So there are things happening. way further to go, I think.
I'd probably break it down into three things from a pharma perspective. This conflict with science that I mentioned right at the beginning, and precision, John, that you've just mentioned, the desire to have a very clear outcome, very clear result from a clinical trial, I think means that populations in terms of inclusion exclusions are refined down to de-risk. And so that's an area within industry, and I think you're exactly right. Trials like registry, randomised clinical trials, we've got one ongoing in the UK at the moment actually, where we're aiming to get 3,000 patients within one study in the UK tapping into registries. You've got to believe that that's going to drive a more diverse inclusion than perhaps a more traditional way of doing it. I think you've obviously then got risk benefit from an experimental point of view. We have to consider that, particularly when you think about, say, pregnant women with investigational products. I think obviously that plays on our minds. But then the third thing, which I think I'm certainly heavily engaged in, is say the inclusion is there, say your design, say your protocol enables, does it still mean you're going to get the diversity you want in your clinical trials? And we've got so much to do to knock down barriers, perception, in lots of different demographics to encourage broader participation. One thing that we're really trying to do is actually encourage a more diverse investigator base within our clinical trials. We find minority investigators are often naive to clinical research. That makes sponsors nervous about using them. So can we get involved and help train and educate them on how to run a clinical trial, so that hopefully that broadens our ability to get out into the community and attract more diversity, because we really want to study our investigational drugs in those patients that are truly experiencing the disease.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Thanks. It's a great question. So I've managed to squeeze another 5 minutes because it's been a great conversation. I'm going to ask each of you to just think about the one message that you would like to give to the audience about how they could be, more patient-centric, and then we're going to go to a question here. Sir.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. In terms of the visibility and accessibility, I noticed my son's 17 and he's just got a provisional driving license, and I noticed that there's a donor card in the house. So he's volunteered as a donor already through applying not to be a donor but to get his driving license. He already thought it through. I thought that was really interesting, and I wondered whether in terms of this session, which has been so interesting and stimulating, it speaks about patient centricity as a title, and you mentioned, Phillippa, about kind of community engagement, and I wonder whether it should be really around kind of citizen centricity, so that people are thinking more about involvement in research and before being a patient, and almost like volunteering. We see it in wildlife trusts when you're auditing the birds that visit your garden during spring, and citizen science is such an amazing growing thing, and I wonder whether there's an opportunity for us as an industry to sort of piggyback on top of that. I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Right, that's a great question. And the way that you guys are all nodding, okay, is that you would all like to, have a contribution to this. So in fact, this is going to be your last points, yeah? So who would like to kick it off?
I'm looking at Natalie.
Well, actually, Paresh and then John. Right.
So just to say, first of all, I think that it should be part of healthcare and much more routinely than it actually is. And then, yes, I agree completely, it should be part of education and schooling. We learn about all sorts of things. I learned about 1066 3 times at school, and it would just be nice as you're getting older, perhaps at the same time as you're getting your driver's license, to understand how research takes place in this country. And I think the thing to piggyback off is the last 2 years, really, because there's a much greater understanding on the whole of science and clinical research in the country at the moment.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with that comment. The sort of piggybacking on what's happened in the last sort of 2 years. Obviously, the Vaccine Registry was a huge success. And we have another campaign within the NIHR, the Be Part of Research. So trying to sort of marry all of those sort of pieces together, and we've got a lot of interest from people over the last 2 years in clinical research. They've seen the importance of it, and we're definitely wanting to support that as much as we can.
John, did you?
Yeah, I think citizen science is absolutely fantastic concept. I really do. When it comes to participation in research on me, I prefer a person-centric view. It just adds value to the individual. And if I had a single message, it would be that science is for absolutely everyone.
Okay. So I think on that point, okay, we're going to have to close this because I'm getting signals from Aline. Positive signals. But this has been absolutely great. The questions we got from the audience were fantastic. I wish I'd actually brought you in earlier, because much better questions than I was giving. That's the way it goes. But I'd like you to show your appreciation of the insights that our panelists have shared this afternoon. And then I think I'm handing over to Aline.
Indeed.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.